What was designed to be a triumphant, independent return to high fashion has instead left a trail of leaked hotel invoices, pointing directly to a mysterious Hollywood benefactor and leaving a husband completely blindsided. I'm glad you've joined me as we begin to unpick the layers of this development. Avenue Montaigne in early October is a theater of the absurd at the best of times, a place where fortunes are worn rather than spent. But Meghan Markle's recent arrival at the Plaza Athénée was heavily orchestrated to be her ultimate show-stopping curtain call. Stepping from the shadowed interior of a black SUV, draped head to toe in what the press was aggressively guided to assume was custom Balenciaga couture, she projected a meticulously staged, almost overwhelming aura of rebirth and total control. Every frantic camera flash, every slight, practiced tilt of the head, and every measured step across the Parisian pavement was precisely calibrated to broadcast a single, unyielding message. The Duchess had miraculously returned, not as a complaining royal exile, but as a global tastemaker ruling fashion's most exclusive inner sanctum. To the casual observer utterly oblivious to the desperate machinations occurring behind the scenes, the comeback narrative felt impeccably locked in, a glossy, impenetrable fairy tale dipped in designer gold that temporarily silenced the mounting, uncomfortable questions back in California. You could see her walking openly in dense crowds, radiating an entirely manufactured serenity, which is just hilarious considering that Prince Harry comes to the United Kingdom every month or so, demanding that the British taxpayer pays for his security because he claims his family simply doesn't feel safe. Beneath this polished, aggressively marketed veneer of effortless luxury, however, a profound and deeply desperate thirst for high society validation was driving every single manicured movement. For a woman whose post-royal ventures have frequently met with what one might charitably call a lukewarm, if not entirely disastrous, reception, this Parisian expedition was vastly less about celebrating fashion and vastly more about securing relevance in an industry that famously forgives everything except being tiresome. We must take a moment to consider the suffocating internal pressure she surely felt during this charade, the endless, grueling rehearsing of the effortless smile in the mirror, masking a creeping, cold realization that her heavily curated, fiercely ambitious empire was built on increasingly unstable quicksand. This extravagant display was undoubtedly meant to be the masterstroke that finally eclipsed the dignified, quiet stability consistently radiating from King Charles and Prince William across the Atlantic. A craven attempt to prove she could effortlessly command the world's attention and adoration without the backing of the ancient institution she so publicly and so loudly discarded. Yet, within the hyper-curated, hermetically sealed bubble of the Plaza Athénée penthouse, where every vase of fresh peonies and every silver tray of room service is positioned for maximum visual impact, the atmosphere must have been intoxicatingly tense, humming with the anxiety of a performer who knows they have forgotten their lines. The sheer emotional toll of maintaining such a flawless, unbothered facade, knowing precisely how precarious the underlying, highly irregular financial arrangements truly were, requires a level of psychological compartmentalization that inevitably begins to fracture under the relentless, unforgiving glare of the global spotlight, while the blinding flashes of the paparazzi successfully distracted the general public with the grand illusion of the situation. The true, deeply embarrassing narrative was quietly unspooling not on the prestigious runway, but within the hushed, deeply discreet back offices of the luxury hotel itself. An exasperated Parisian staff accountant, reportedly buckling under the sheer weight of mounting media speculation, and perhaps possessing a touch of that famous, biting French disdain for gaudy Hollywood artifice, quietly made a unilateral decision that would irreparably shatter the entire expensive illusion. Without the self-important fanfare of a press conference or the manufactured theatrics of a deliberate PR leak, scanned invoices stamped with unforgiving, unalterable digital timecodes were discreetly transmitted to a prominent, highly inquisitive European entertainment journalist. A well-placed source noted with a certain grim satisfaction that these sensitive financial files were absolutely never meant to see the light of day. Yet within mere hours, the polite, questioning whispers of the fashion elite had mutated into cold, undeniable digital evidence circulating across every major editorial desk in Europe and beyond. These were not simply standard hotel receipts. They were blatant, humiliating contradictions to the grand narrative she had just spent days aggressively selling to the world. A devastatingly mundane paper trail detailing thousands of euros stacked up in penthouse charges, private security details, exorbitant luxury styling services, and endless black car transportation. The clinical, uncompromising reality of accounting codes and billing addresses possesses a devastating power to completely cut through even the most expensive, highly coordinated public relations spin, laying bare the deeply transactional, utterly hollow nature of an event that had been sold to the gullible public as a triumphant organic coronation of transatlantic style. The final fatal blow to this carefully constructed, wildly expensive house of cards arrived with ruthless, breathtaking efficiency from the very institution she appeared to be so proudly championing on the streets of Paris. When diligent, skeptical reporters naturally reached out to the higher echelons of Balenciaga to confirm their generous patronage of this spectacular royal return, the legendary fashion house shut the speculation down with a speed and absolute finality that sent immediate shockwaves through the industry. "We did not sponsor her stay," they stated clearly, directly, and without a shred of emotion, offering absolutely no wiggle room, no polite PR deflection, and no face-saving ambiguity for the increasingly disgraced Duchess to hide her blushes behind. Suddenly, the sterile, highly controlled bubble of the Parisian elite transformed overnight from an intoxicating, glamorous playground into a deeply claustrophobic trap, as the relentless French media began forensically dissecting every single line item and questionable authorization code on those leaked, damning documents. For a woman who has spent years ruthlessly controlling her narrative, silencing critics with legal threats, and dictating her own highly subjective truth, the sudden jarring realization that she could not spin, manipulate, or charm her way out of a simple, verifiable hotel invoice must have been a profoundly destabilizing, truly terrifying experience. The long-term, inescapable consequences of this entirely unforced error are frankly staggering, effectively destroying whatever fragile remnants existed of her effortless luxury narrative and permanently branding her not as a sought-after, inspiring muse of the fashion world, but as a deeply opportunistic, transactional figure desperately scrambling for relevance, completely exposed beneath the harsh lights of reality. We must also deeply analyze the devastating optics of this unraveling charade, particularly when juxtaposed against the genuine, dutiful work being carried out simultaneously by the actual working members of the royal family. While Meghan Markle was frantically busy orchestrating this sickest of stunts, a desperate, transparent attempt to hijack the global news cycle and plaster her face across the international tabloids, Prince William and King Charles were quietly going about the solemn, unglamorous business of state, naturally garnering the sort of widespread, authentic respect that no amount of Parisian PR spin can ever artificially manufacture. The sheer audacity required to parade oneself through the crowded streets of France, soaking up the flashbulbs like a parched sponge, while simultaneously insisting back home that life in the public eye is an unbearable, life-threatening burden, is a contradiction so glaring it borders on the spectacular. A source within the inner circle has heavily intimated that this level of blatant, unapologetic hypocrisy is precisely what alienates even her most ardent, forgiving supporters, leaving her increasingly isolated on an island of her own arrogant making. Ultimately, this catastrophic Parisian excursion proves beyond a shadow of a doubt that you can hire the most expensive image consultants in Hollywood, you can drape yourself in the finest European couture, and you can demand non-disclosure agreements from every terrified bellboy in the arrondissement. but you simply cannot buy authenticity or class. When the final invoice is tallied, all that remains is the stark, unflattering reality of a woman utterly consumed by the pursuit of a status she seems fundamentally incapable of grasping, leaving a trail of broken illusions and unpaid emotional debts in her wake. The digital dissemination of these highly compromising financial documents was nothing short of spectacular, spreading across the internet with the ferocious speed and devastating efficiency of a wildfire consuming dry brush. Within hours of the initial quiet leak from that ostensibly pressured Parisian accountant, armies of online sleuths and armchair detectives had descended upon the blurred screenshots, dissecting every single exorbitant line item with forensic, unforgiving precision. What they uncovered beneath the glamorous, heavily filtered veneer of Avenue Montaigne was a staggeringly chaotic financial paper trail that completely annihilated the meticulously crafted narrative of a self-sufficient, fiercely independent global philanthropist operating at the height of her powers. The sheer audacity of the recorded expenses, including a staggering $3,200 retainer for a freelance stylist and wildly exorbitant charges for late-night off-menu room service, painted a vivid, inescapable portrait of breathtaking entitlement that stood in stark, almost comedic contrast to her highly publicized humanitarian branding. Furthermore, it was the glaringly mismatched authorization codes and profoundly irregular corporate billing addresses that truly ignited the firestorm, transforming a simple story of luxury travel into a deeply troubling mystery regarding hidden benefactors and deliberately concealed financial conduits. For an audience already primed to view the Sussexes' commercial endeavors with a healthy, well-earned dose of cynicism, these chaotic, utterly contradictory receipts served as the ultimate, undeniable proof that the sleek, professional image being aggressively sold to the public was nothing more than an expensive, precariously balanced mirage. Faced with this insurmountable mountain of irrefutable, deeply embarrassing digital evidence, the usually relentless and hyper-aggressive Montecito public relations machine abruptly ground to a complete, deafening halt. We are, of course, entirely accustomed to a near-constant barrage of verbose, heavily sanitized statements from their camp, eagerly clarifying the slightest perceived slight or breathlessly championing the Duchess's latest, inevitably self-aggrandizing initiative to anyone who will listen. Yet in the immediate brutal aftermath of the Paris invoice leak, the silence emanating from their California fortress was not merely noticeable. It was absolute, suffocating, and profoundly telling to anyone familiar with their usual operational playbook. Her primary publicist's telephone number reportedly rang out endlessly without an answer, while highly anticipated, previously scheduled digital appearances and carefully arranged promotional interviews were quietly, unceremoniously postponed, without a single coherent word of explanation provided to the increasingly bewildered press corps. This total, unprecedented shutdown of their normally hyperactive communication channels practically screamed of internal panic, signaling to the watching world that they had entirely lost control of the script and were completely bereft of any viable, face-saving counter-narrative. The silence, far from starving the story of necessary oxygen, only served to rapidly accelerate the mounting speculation, effectively confirming the absolute worst suspicions of her critics and leaving her few remaining corporate allies deeply unsettled by the sheer amateurishness of the unfolding crisis. Behind the heavy, tightly locked security gates of their sprawling Montecito estate, the domestic reality of this unspooling public relations catastrophe was reportedly characterized by a claustrophobic, intensely bitter atmosphere of frantic frustration and dawning realization. A source within the inner circle has painted a rather bleak, deeply uncomfortable picture of the scene behind closed doors, describing a woman pacing the expansive halls in a state of visible, tearful agitation, utterly consumed by the terrifying knowledge that the heavily compartmentalized eras of her carefully constructed life were violently, unavoidably colliding. Meghan's frantic, desperate attempts to somehow regain control of the spiraling global narrative were allegedly met with the harsh, unforgiving reality that absolutely no amount of smooth Hollywood spin could possibly erase the cold, hard numbers printed on those leaked Parisian documents. Conversely, Prince Harry's emotional state during this chaotic period was described as one of profound, paralyzing confusion, a feeling slowly giving way to a deeply humiliating sense of his own fundamental inadequacy and utter irrelevance within the complex, highly transactional machinery of his wife's commercial ambitions. He had apparently operated under the naive, entirely misplaced assumption that this glamorous European excursion had been properly vetted, fully financed, and securely managed by their expansive, fiercely expensive team of legal and public relations advisors. The sudden, jarring realization that he was entirely out of the loop regarding the true, highly questionable financial architecture of his own wife's supposedly triumphant comeback must have struck a devastating, incredibly painful blow to whatever remaining pride he possessed. The suffocating tension within that California mansion rapidly manifested into a brutal, exhausting bunker mentality characterized by frantic, late-night strategy sessions and desperately heated conference calls with their increasingly exasperated crisis management teams scattered across multiple time zones. The atmosphere inside the room was undeniably heavy, with the agonizing, unspoken acknowledgement that every single available option for mitigating the disaster carried a severe, potentially fatal risk to their already deeply bruised and highly fragile global brand. To issue a forceful, direct denial of the invoices' authenticity would virtually guarantee further, even more damaging document leaks from the deeply irritated European press, while attempting to honestly clarify the incredibly messy financial web would only serve to legally tie them to the profoundly embarrassing reality of the situation. Every proposed public statement was agonizingly weighed, furiously debated, and ultimately discarded, leaving the supposedly unified couple trapped in a paralyzing state of indecision while the merciless, unforgiving digital news cycle continued to aggressively tear their carefully guarded reputation to absolute shreds. This was no longer merely a passing PR hiccup or a minor, easily forgotten social faux pas. It was an unspinnable existential crisis that struck at the very heart of their heavily monetized public identity, exposing a shocking lack of foresight, fundamental business competence, and basic institutional control. The sheer exhausting emotional weight of this relentless, entirely self-inflicted pressure cooker must have been profoundly debilitating, permanently fracturing the fragile, heavily managed facade of serene domestic bliss they so desperately attempt to project to the outside world. Looking beyond the immediate visceral humiliation of the current news cycle, the long-term, inescapable consequences of this disastrous Parisian misadventure are poised to be utterly devastating to the couple's future commercial viability on the global stage. In the ruthless, highly transactional world of elite corporate partnerships and luxury brand endorsements, absolute trust and fundamental competence are the essential, non-negotiable currencies of the realm, and this spectacular unraveling has thoroughly bankrupted their standing on both critical fronts. Potential high-net-worth investors, elite-level philanthropists, and prestigious fashion houses are currently watching this chaotic, utterly amateurish spectacle unfold from the sidelines with a mixture of quiet horror and profound, icy professional detachment. The brutal, unspoken consensus rapidly solidifying in executive boardrooms from New York to London is devastatingly simple. If this extensive, highly paid team cannot effectively manage the logistics of a standard, albeit luxurious hotel booking without triggering a messy, globally embarrassing scandal, absolutely no serious self-respecting brand will ever risk the catastrophic reputational damage of a formal association. Reputation in these highly exclusive, fiercely guarded circles is incredibly difficult to build and phenomenally easy to destroy. And once a controversial public figure crosses the invisible threshold from exclusive talent to radioactive liability, the road to recovery is virtually non-existent. Meghan Markle may have traveled to Paris with the desperate, burning ambition of permanently cementing her status as an untouchable global powerhouse, but she has ultimately returned entirely diminished, forever tethered to a humiliating paper trail that vividly exposes the hollow, deeply insecure reality hiding just beneath the expensive designer gloss. As the relentless digital excavation of those Parisian hotel invoices continued, the trail of highly irregular financial breadcrumbs began to lead definitively away from the glittering boulevards of the French capital and straight into the sun-drenched, fiercely guarded enclaves of Hollywood's media elite. Investigative journalists and online sleuths poring over the convoluted electronic signatures, obscure payment processors, and murky offshore accounts eventually zeroed in on a set of initials that sent an immediate, icy chill through the Duchess's tightly knit inner circle. Behind those seemingly innocuous letters was an undeniable, deeply established connection to a highly influential, extraordinarily wealthy Los Angeles media figure, discreetly dubbed Mr. X by those in the know, who had frequently moved in the exact same ambitious social scenes as Meghan, long before her spectacularly orchestrated royal chapter with Prince Harry ever began. For a woman who has spent the better part of a decade meticulously rewriting her own personal history, ruthlessly excising inconvenient individuals, and heavily compartmentalizing the various distinct eras of her rapid social ascent, the sudden emergence of this specific phantom from her pre-royal past must have been a moment of absolute, paralyzing terror. We must consider the profound internal panic she undoubtedly experienced as she realized that her fiercely protected, highly sanitized present was violently, unavoidably colliding with a past she thought she had successfully buried beneath titles, tiaras, and multi-million-dollar streaming deals. The immediate, burning question that naturally arose from this explosive revelation was one of deeply uncomfortable motive. Precisely why would a remarkably wealthy, highly connected American media executive quietly funnel thousands of euros through heavily obscured corporate accounts to fund a supposedly independent fashion excursion for the Duchess of Sussex? Was this incredibly generous financial arrangement a remnant of old, unwavering loyalty, a quiet, heavily leveraged favor, or perhaps something considerably deeper and far more transactional originating from their shared Hollywood years? A well-placed source has emphatically indicated that the absolute worst aspect of this entire sordid affair was the humiliating manner in which the Duke of Sussex actually discovered the true origins of his wife's Parisian funding. Instead of learning about this highly sensitive financial lifeline through the basic foundational trust of a private marital conversation, Prince Harry reportedly found himself reading about the intricate details of Mr. X's generous patronage in the exact same glaring media reports as the rest of the utterly bewildered global public. To be completely blindsided by such a profound, fundamental deception regarding your own wife's professional and financial arrangements is a staggering blow to any marriage, but to have that betrayal broadcast across the international news cycle for the entire world to eagerly dissect is an indignity that borders on the cruel. Within the echoing, increasingly lonely halls of their sprawling Californian mansion, one can only begin to imagine the profound, agonizing psychological unraveling that Prince Harry must have endured upon fully digesting the stark reality of this deeply humiliating public exposure. For a man who so aggressively abandoned his family, his country, and his lifelong sense of dutiful purpose under the heavily pushed, romanticized guise of protecting his fiercely independent wife, the dawning realization that he is now entirely outside the loop of her most consequential operations must have been utterly devastating. This was not merely a fleeting moment of marital miscommunication. It was the chilling, inescapable crystallization of his own fundamental irrelevance within the complex, ruthlessly ambitious machinery of her post-royal career, forcing him to confront the agonizing possibility that he has ultimately served his primary purpose. The sheer, suffocating weight of realizing that his prestigious royal title and global notoriety may have simply been highly effective stepping stones to secure access to the very billionaire benefactors who are now quietly picking up the tab must be a profoundly bitter pill for the prince to swallow. The atmosphere surrounding the prince was described as one of profound, hollow shock, as the heavily guarded illusion of an unbreakable, deeply communicative partnership was brutally stripped away, leaving behind a desperately isolated man who suddenly realizes he no longer recognizes the script he is actively living. The devastating domestic fallout from this staggering revelation inevitably spilled over into the couple's subsequent heavily scrutinized public engagements, completely shattering the meticulously maintained optical illusion of a fiercely united front taking on the world together. Where there were once deeply choreographed displays of cloying, inescapable physical affection and knowing, utterly rehearsed glances of mutual adoration, observers now noted an icy, palpable distance that no amount of expensive public relations spin could possibly manage to successfully obscure. Cameras at several high-profile charity events captured a series of deeply uncomfortable interactions, characterized by incredibly polite, agonizingly thin smiles that barely masked the profound, fractured foundation of a partnership visibly buckling under the immense weight of its own internal contradictions. A source behind closed doors has recently painted a rather bleak, highly alarming picture of the current state of their union, whispering intensely about frantic, hushed telephone calls to prominent legal advisors and a pervasive, heavy tension that seems to poison the very air within their heavily fortified domestic compound. The once warm, supposedly impenetrable bond that the couple aggressively marketed to the public as the ultimate modern love story has, by all visible metrics, rapidly deteriorated into a deeply strained, profoundly uncomfortable proximity, heavily monitored by anxious image consultants who are desperately trying to hold back the rising tide of undeniable reality. Looking objectively at the long-term, inescapable consequences of this entire disastrous Parisian financial revelation, we are witnessing the fatal, highly public cracking of the foundational us against the world narrative that has sustained the Sussexes' deeply controversial brand for the past several years. The fundamental, heavily romanticized optical illusion of a fiercely devoted couple bravely forging an independent path together has now been permanently, irreparably replaced by the stark, unforgiving image of a highly transactional, profoundly disjointed alliance that appears to be running entirely on toxic fumes. As the relentless global media continues to ruthlessly unpick the remaining fragile threads of this deeply compromised financial arrangement, the devastating reality of their current situation becomes increasingly, undeniably clear to even their most loyal, fiercely defensive supporters. They are no longer viewed as the progressive, deeply in love trailblazers they once so desperately positioned themselves to be, but rather as two increasingly isolated, fundamentally disconnected individuals who are desperately clinging to the rapidly fading remnants of a shared illusion. In the ruthless, highly perceptive empire of elite public relations and global reputation, a heavily manufactured facade can only withstand so many brutal, undeniable collisions with the truth before it finally, inevitably shatters, leaving behind nothing but the undeniable, embarrassing wreckage of a carefully calculated gamble that ultimately, spectacularly failed.